Thank you. So, Chris, I'm delighted to have you as a guest in the podcast. I so much enjoyed your book, Heroic Leadership. Um, it all centers around Jesuitism and leadership in the Jesuitism world. But for listeners who do not know what Jesuitism is, could you perhaps briefly explain what it is?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for the chance. It's a pleasure to be with you and your listeners. And so we'll talk a bit about my own life story, which connects to being a Jesuit. But as you say, what the heck is a Jesuit, huh?
Yeah.
And I'll explain very briefly and maybe oversimplify and misstate a tiny bit, one or two things, just to make it easily understandable. So first of all, the Jesuits are a religious order of priests and brothers within the Catholic Church. So that's the first thing. They're within the Catholic umbrella, the Roman Catholic umbrella. And, most of the churches and parishes in the Catholic tradition would be run by priests who live in the area and who are part of the diocese. But the Catholic Church has always had this tradition that there are some what's called religious orders that come up often because they're following the inspiration of a certain founder. So probably people, whatever is their tradition, have heard of Dominicans, Franciscans. Yeah. Dominicans were founded by St. Dominic, who lived in the 13th century, I believe. Same with St. Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscans. And the Jesuits were in a generation that came together around 1540, and Ignatius of Loyola was the founder. And usually each of these orders is distinguished maybe because it does a certain kind of work, like maybe they mostly do teaching, or they have a certain style of praying, like Benedictines would live in a monastery, or they have a certain kind of spirituality, a certain way of thinking about the world. So the Jesuits, to oversimplify now, would be one stream of priests within the Catholic Church that have a certain history and certain traditions.
Chris, you already alluded a little bit to that. What did your personal journey look like? Because you were brought up, or let's say you attended the Jesuits, you became a Jesuit seminarian, and then you went to very, very senior roles in J.P. Morgan. And then you decided to move back from the business world to the non-profit world. Can you explain your journey?
Probably not. But let me tell you the 2-minute version of the biography, so to speak. And then, in the course of the conversation of questions, you may want to come back and unpack one or another piece of it, and that's fine. So I'm a New York City boy. Those who've flown into New York City, LaGuardia Airport, know where I grew up, basically right there. I attended a secondary school run by the Jesuits. Right after finishing, so 18 years old in the U.S. system, I started studying to be a Jesuit priest myself. I thought this might be my calling. And then after a few years, I realized this is not my path in life. I mean, I'm happy with my religious beliefs, but my calling was not to be a priest. As many listeners would know, in the Catholic Church, priests are required to be celibate. And for example, this, for many people, they realize is not their calling. So the last thing I was doing as a Jesuit was teaching in one of their secondary schools. I was teaching economics. I had a plan A for my life, to be a priest. I didn't have a plan B. So I don't know. I mean, I'm teaching economics. I'm here in New York City. There are a lot of big banks. Maybe I can just get a job in one of these places for a couple of years, and in a way my life will be a do-over. I'm thinking, like I'll just get my feet under me and decide where to go with my life. And I was lucky enough to get a opportunity to join J.P. Morgan's management training program, and I had about a 2-decade career there, and was lucky enough to serve in management committees in Asia, in Europe, back in the U.S., It was a very wonderful, fruitful career for me, but I just also always had a feeling that I didn't want my life only to say that I had spent 45 years working in a big bank, an American bank. So I always had an idea about a next chapter. I thought it would be very interesting to write one of these leadership lessons books, which is part of why you and I are together.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I left and wrote that book. And since then, I've been doing some writing, some speaking, and some board work in a large hospital system.
In terms of leadership, and you already mentioned it quickly, in your book you describe the 4 key values of the Jesuit leadership style, which is self-awareness, ingenuity, love, and heroism. That doesn't look like a typical leadership development framework as I've learned it and basically implemented many times. Could you perhaps explain the thinking behind each of these values and their importance?
Yeah, for sure. And maybe it would also be illuminating for folks to understand just how I went in that direction,
Yeah.
So as we just chatted, I did 2 very different things with my life. I was studying to be a certain priest in a religious order. Then I'm working at J.P. Morgan.
Yeah.
You work in a big company, you read all kinds of literature about management. And sometimes I used to think, the training I received as a Jesuit is actually more relevant.
Remarkably.
To J.P. Morgan life than some of these books that people are giving about leadership and management. So I thought, it might be fun, might be interesting to try to think about the Jesuits, if I could put it this way, as a company, so to speak. Like what by any human measure, this has been a remarkably flourishing human organization. And of course, religious people will believe, and I believe that this has some religious dimensions to it. But, heck, there are many, many, many religious institutions that start and fail, so there must be some human wisdom as well as to why some thrive and others do not. So that was my project. Could I think about what seemed to be relevant ways that of their culture, let's put it that way, that would be relevant to the rest of us, whether have no religious belief, some religious belief, work in a big company, work in a small one, it doesn't matter, huh? So this was my project, so to speak. And I was trying to take values that, in Jesuit life often would have a religious root to them, but translate them into a language that would be accessible to people of any belief, no belief. So somebody might say, oh, okay, I get it. I understand self-awareness and so on. So this was the nature of my project. Yeah. And I took stories from the early Jesuits and then tried to extract some wisdom about managing or leading in any circumstance. And
it's kind of decoding the...
So to speak, yeah. Let me just, for the moment, just define each of those 4 ideas, because I think to explain all of it just in one answer would be quite boring for your listeners. So I'll just quickly define each, and then we come back over as you wish. So to be self-aware usually is apparent to everybody. The way I talk about it is people who are leading well understand their own strengths and weaknesses, their own values. They have a point of view of how to treat other people. Most of us are familiar with language like emotional intelligence as being leaders, and self-awareness,
or basically being vulnerable. Those type of
would somehow fit into this frame, huh? And the second idea of ingenuity. What I'm getting at is that in order to lead well in the current world, we have to be adaptive, creative, innovative, open to change. The world is changing very rapidly, and unless we are also able to adapt what should be adapted, we're not going to do well. And third, heroism, and by that I don't mean like being famous. Rather, the core of this idea to me is that we are going to work for a mission that's greater than ourselves, a purpose that's greater than ourselves. In other words, I come to the company and there's the great drama of, okay, this is mostly about me. How do I get ahead? My status, my ego? How do I compete against these other people? Or I come to the company and my attitude is, okay, we're here for some purpose that's bigger than me and my ego and status, and I'm going to invest some of my energy in a purpose that's bigger than myself. So this is the essence of heroism. And then finally, love. And by that, I don't mean, and certainly didn't mean, I'm walking around hugging people and saying I love them, but rather, really from even the medieval philosophers through to the present, one of the core definitions of to love has been to want what's good for others and to try to bring that about. And so maybe to translate that into an organizational language, we might say, okay, look, to be a loving leader means that I accept that each person, of course, is dignified, but also has some real human potential and talent.
Yeah.
And my job as a colleague, as a manager, is to develop and unlock that talent and help each person to flourish and achieve to the best of their ability. So those are the four ideas that the book is built around.
Yeah. And I think one of the phrases in the book is, I don't know if I can, but it's something like having always one foot lifted or whatever, in the sense of always be prepared to move. Can you say a few words around that one?
I mean, it's good. Your recollection is good. Although I must say, a lot of people seize on that phrase. It's a great phrase, huh? And it was just, I think, now I have to remember myself. It was either Ignatius or the founder of the Jesuits, or
I think it was Ignatius. But you're the expert.
One of the next generation, a guy named Nadal, and they were trying to convey in a letter to younger trainees, what should be the spirit of Jesuits. And then he has this great phrase that they have to be people who are living with one foot raised. Like, in other words,
exactly.
You're always ready for the next step. Always kind of leaning. Okay, where do we have to go now? What's next? What do we have to do? What's important? It's a really great phrase. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the great Jesuit leadership principles you mentioned several times in the book, and I love that one, is greater love than fear. And you see that also as the basis for great teamwork. Now, I can imagine how this works in a religious order, but if you look at environments that you and I've worked, like, now let's say ultra competitive banks, competitive both outside, competitive inside. How do you bring in greater love than fear in, for instance, companies like J.P. Morgan or other investment banks? How does that work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And let me first unpack the idea and then try to justify it in a management way, because it's the real question at the end of the day. So first of all, the word when I was writing the book was problematic for me too, because I knew what I was trying to get at in terms of behavior. And then I say, okay, what word can I put on this? And I thought about words like, respect, deep respect. But the problem, at least in the US context, is that, every company has like respect as one of their core values, yet many people feel in reality we treat each other like animals. So the word has been totally devalued and makes us only feel cynical or jaded, it's nonsense. So I say, okay, I can't use this word. And love was actually the word Ignatius used, as you quoted. He said, that managers, they wouldn't use the word manager, but superiors in Jesuit life should manage with greater love than fear. In other words, we don't want to be an organization that motivates primarily by threatening or frightening people that they may lose their job, rather by the way we treat them in a positive way. So I say, okay, well, that's the word he uses, so I have to use this word. Now, let's bring it to the real world of organizations. And I mentioned to you that before that definitionally the idea would be, okay, that it means wanting the good for those who work for me or alongside me. It means recognize their potential, trying to develop that potential. And I remember this long after the book is published, reading a survey from that McKinsey had done, the big consulting firm, of executives at a large number of their clients, and they distilled this into a set of behaviors that characterize the best leaders in their organization. Okay, that was their methodology.
Yeah.
And then they wrote an article that said, okay, these are the common ones. And often if I give a conference or a presentation, I excerpt about half of the qualities that McKinsey spoke about. And I think that if I said to our listeners here, okay, look, just play with me for a moment here. Why don't you write on a piece of paper, if you could imagine what would love, how would it show itself in an organization or corporate environment? You know, like what kinds of behaviors would indicate
What would you see?
somebody who had this kind of attitude? And I bet that what people are thinking of right now or jot down in a paper would be, in fact, very much aligned with the research that McKinsey came up with that had nothing to do with love. They said the most effective behaviors of their best managers included things like support employees, give praise, give good feedback, give opportunity, and so on and so on. So I think you understand where I'm going. You know that that here is if we just get ourselves beyond whatever visceral wonder or question or reaction we might have to the word love, and go a step further and say, okay, well, what could this mean or look like? I think we would come up with a set of behaviors that in fact align very well with what the best research is telling us about what it takes to motivate people to perform their best in organizations.
Yeah. The other thing that I really liked in your book is the notion that leadership is an activity, and what you wrote is that the Jesuits, instead of talking about leadership, they lived it. And you know, basically, you list 4 elements. You said we're all leaders, we're all leading all the time, well or poorly. Leadership springs from within. It's about who I am as much as what I do. Leadership is an act. It is my life, a way of living in which basic life strategies and principles reinforce one another. And finally, I never complete a task of becoming a leader. It's an ongoing process, which I told to one of my coaching clients this afternoon. So I literally said, look, I'm going to interview someone, and this lesson is something you would take to heart. But there are 2 elements there which I wonder if you could expand a little bit. And the first one would be leadership springs from within. It's about who I am as much as what I do. Can you say a few words around that one?
Yeah, so I guess about that idea, so we had the slang in the US about this manager or that manager. Oh man, this guy's an empty suit. I mean, it may sound a little that it's referring to men, but basically what we meant was, okay, this guy is it's basically just an act.
Yeah.
We're not sure if there's anything inside there.
The substance,
or what it is, or maybe what it is today is different than what it will be tomorrow based on this person's weather vane of what politically will be better, you know? And nobody likes that, you know, that, I mean, we may feel like we have to comply because I don't have a choice, but that inherently is not motivating for anybody.
We miss the authenticity and then genuineness,
So in a way, that's kind of what it's getting at. Like, in other words, that the people that I think tend to be the most inspiring, motivating leaders who induce loyalty are people where we say, yes, you know, there's somebody real here. This person knows what they stand for. They stand for things that I happen to admire. I admire also their constancy, you know, and it comes from within, you know, it's not just like tips or tactics, you know, that's another fallacy we tend to have, you know, that good leadership means I just know the right things to say or do, and that can manipulate you into doing what I want you to do, as if, you know, you're like a little pet or an animal, and I have to know the right tricks, you know. So it's really drawing a contrast between, no, it's not about tips and tactics. It's not about manipulating others. It's about coming from something that's known by me, understood by me, and that I am willing to stand for.
Yeah. If I switch gears a little bit, a key notion in the book is indifference, a state of detachment from things, people, and experiences. And when I read this in your book, it reminded me of the importance of indifference in Stoic philosophy. Do you think there's some parallels there between the thinking of the Jesuits and the Stoics, or is it a completely different concept? What's your thinking about
I
it?
suspect, I mean, it's. I think there absolutely is some parallelisms, as there would be. Sometimes people also associate this idea with pieces of Buddhism.
Yeah.
But there is clearly parallelisms, but also possible misunderstandings, and if I had to write the book over again, I think I might spend a little bit more time unpacking what I meant, because the word, or what the Jesuits mean, because the word indifference is a tricky word in contemporary American English, at least, because when to say I'm indifferent to something, tends to mean I don't like it, And I think the insight that Ignatius was getting at is, he says, not literally, I paraphrase, but okay, so first we need to have a clear sense of goal or mission, objective, purpose, whatever is the right phrase for the moment, about the big picture of what we're living for, what we're trying to accomplish as an organization, or what our mission is, So we need to get this clear. And then he says, we need to free ourselves from, to use my modern word, internal baggage, our baggage that would stand in the way of making us free enough to pursue the mission wholeheartedly, in a ambitious way, in a free way, whatever it may be. And so his idea is, indifference to him means not that I dislike something. It means that I try. Here's another image that he sometimes uses that's sometimes helpful. Before major forks in the road, major choices, major decisions, I need to be at first like a scale that's in balance, and where just I'm going to make my choice based on whichever way the evidence pushes me, not based on my biases, my fears, my status needs, my ego needs, my concerns, all of this stuff. He says, I want to try to understand this baggage inside me and set it aside so that I'm indifferent, free, open, and then able to go fast to follow the mission. And I hope I explained that clearly enough, because I find it a very powerful idea, and in organizational life, for example, what you often find is, especially, you have a financial services background as I do, especially in places where you could get paid very well, is that people show up and a lot of it becomes about my power, my status, my ego, my money, my wealth, whatever. I don't mean that people are consciously saying, oh, I'm going to make every decision based on what will bring the most wealth or status or power to me.
No, but
may not be explicitly thinking that way, but somehow this is what's driving.
Yeah, it's kind of corrupted. It starts playing an important role in the process.
So this is the point. Could we make ourselves free of all that stuff to say, okay, well, look, I mean, of course I want to get ahead, but I'm here because I'm here to work for a mission, and I have to put, devote my energy and ego and efforts to help this team achieve this mission, not just to my own self-interested drives.
And another notion that really appealed to me in your book was the idea of knowing that you are being loved as a basis for empowerment. There are not many management books that I've read, and as you can see, I've got a lot of bookcases behind me. There's not a single one of them that basically explicitly discusses the importance of being loved as a basis for empowerment. Um, Perhaps you can explain, let's say, the importance of being loved, and perhaps also if and how it's related to what we currently call in business self-compassion.
Yeah. So here's, here I'll try to explain the idea and then maybe use an example from Ignatius' own life to kind of illustrate the whole. So, I think for a lot of us in corporate life, you're as good as your last choice, or you're as good as what I need now, or you're as good as this, that, or the other thing. And that's fundamentally different from the idea of, okay, you're on the team, I support you. And this is the fundamental idea, huh?
To
illustrate from his own life, there's a story about, I forget the exact details, but basically some guy out in what Jesuits would have called the missions, away from headquarters, made some decision and basically screwed it up. So he writes this letter back to headquarters, basically saying, okay, I screwed it up, and I guess he's ready for what would happen in corporate life. Your head's going to get cut off. You're going to get in trouble. And basically the letter that comes back to him is, to paraphrase, basically says, my order to you is, in the future, make sure you just make your own best decisions. You're the guy who's doing the job. You're the one who's there.
You're the guy. It reads a little bit like you're the guy on the ground, local circus.
We support you and so on. So I think that's the kind of difference. Do we feel, and that's very empowering, do we feel like, okay, my talents and abilities are somehow recognized and trusted, and I'm being supported here to do my best work? Or do I feel like basically I always have to look over my shoulder for, being exposed or caught? Yeah.
It's your book contains a number of examples of truly heroic undertakings of the Jesuits, particularly in South America, but also highly adventurous in India, China, and Japan. And what struck me about these stories was the profound self-sacrifice of the Jesuits, inspired by their sense of calling. Now, for me, that raises two questions, and I don't know if you have an answer to them, but basically they jumped into my mind when I read it. Do you think, what would be ways that basically, listeners to the podcast could bring the joy, sense of duty and responsibility that comes from serving a purpose greater than oneself into our commercial and, often Darwinistic workplaces?
Yeah, it's a great observation. And I think it's a very profound dilemma, frankly, and usually we're not willing to have this profound kind of discussion in life. But maybe I could say this: no Jesuit actually said this to me, because I think they like the book and they're polite and everything else. But a couple of guys who I respect quite deeply, they didn't put it this way, but I think what they want to get at was something like, well, the book is great and all these kinds of things, but these guys, at the end of the day, they didn't do these amazing things because they had a workbook about being heroic, self-aware, and genius and loving. They did all these things because they had a very deep sense of mission, in their sense, religious mission, a calling and belief that they felt was worth everything to them, and that's true. I feel like I did lay out some principles that I think are very relevant and very valuable, but now you're kind of opening up the dilemma of okay, well, in life, there's working for a paycheck, and there's what's we all consider of ultimate value, and maybe even to take it out of the sphere of religion for a moment, because that could sometimes be neuralgic for people. We could put it in terms of family, like if I know once hearing a woman speak very eloquently about her child being sick, and she would do anything for the child.
Yeah.
And we all recognize that. Of course we do. And we also would say, I'm not going to have quite that devotion about selling clothing or whatever my profession happens to be. So I think there's genuinely a profound dilemma there, and to me, I guess my own feeling is, can we as individuals, in our various workplaces, find things that speak to our own sense of what is important in life? Many of us feel, okay, if I could, for example, develop teammates and colleagues to be their best, that really is worth some heroism. I kind of really believe in that. Or, I really have such deep integrity that I want to give my clients something that's really good, not just to make money for myself, but to do that. And likewise, if we're managers, can we elicit that in people? So I think you kind of opened up a rich vein there that is not put to bed just with one or two sentences.
No. Chris, call to action. You recently published a workbook as a sequel to this, or as a kind of addition to this. Can you say a few things about what drove you to write this workbook and what it's about?
Yeah. I don't know if you put up the video or the photo or not, but the workbook you'll see has a parallel.
Yeah, it's very clearly visible, and I'll make sure that I include a link to it in the show notes. Definitely.
And the workbook came out like about 20 years after the original book.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is not to say that I'm a slow writer, but hopefully I'm self-aware enough in this point in my life to appreciate that I know what I'm good at and bad at. And, people would often say to me that the book in a way shows, well, this is what it looks like, but could you give me a better blueprint of what I do in order to become a leader? They're really asking for a workbook, and I really don't feel I have those kind of skills. And then a learning management company came to me and wanted to do a asynchronous online program about heroic leadership. And so one of their team members, Judy Waring, is an expert in precisely how to translate things to exercises. And so we teamed together to produce this, and it exactly parallels the ideas that you and I have been talking about. Self-awareness, ingenuity, heroism, love. And for each of those pillars, there are a few exercises. You could just see from the shape of that.
Yeah, definitely.
It's a kind of an invitation to people to say, okay, now think about this, or think about that. Like people are challenged to think about their values, what's important, and there's prompt about that. People are, you and I spoke about being free, being indifferent. So there are exercises about trying to inventory, what are my baggage? What are the ego or other issues that tend to hold me back from being free enough? There are exercises about going through my past life and trying to pick out moments of either great achievement or great failure, and what lesson could I unpack from those things. So that's the idea of workbook.
Chris, during this conversation, we discussed many different elements of heroic leadership. Are there any elements we have not mentioned and that you would find important to mention at the end of this podcast? And any final thoughts?
I think only one, which in a way is the most fundamental idea of all, that usually, at least in the US context, people tend to think of the idea of leadership very much in hierarchical positional terms. So if I ask people to think of leaders, they would think of, Donald Trump, the Pope, or something. They're never going to think about themselves. And the foundational idea that I think implicitly ran through everything you and I spoke about, but I didn't say it out loud, is that how each person needs to think, okay, this is not about what Emmanuel Macron or the president of the US or any place else should do. This is about me, And one of the dictionary definitions of leadership is to point out a way or a direction or goal and to influence others toward it.
Yeah.
And really, everybody's doing this. You know, if I'm a parent, teacher, manager, I'm implicitly, by my behavior, by how I treat people, by my priorities, how I use my time and money, this is somehow implicitly pointing away, you know, and we're implicitly, not implicitly, we're literally, of course, having some influence. Some of us have a lot of public platform for influence. Others of us just on our colleagues, neighbors, children, whatever it may be, but everybody is somehow pointing away and having influence. So I think, you know, as we finish the whole discussion, I don't want to overlook this very foundational idea that all of this is not about what this managing director should do or what I should do if I become a managing director. It's about your life or my life just now.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris, for this interview. I learned a lot from it. I really found the book inspiring. I really was inspired by our conversation. So thank you very much for participating.
It was my pleasure to do it. Thank you.